Mm.
Okay, still letting in a few more.
Good.
Oh, Susan. Hi, Susan. Hi.
Hello.
Good to see you.
Hello,
Yeah.
Birgit, Gottfried, Louise, I see you, Emmy, Sarah.
Yes.
All right.
Mm.
Okay, I turned off the waiting room, so I guess anyone can just come in anytime. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight, or this morning. Sorry, Patricia and Susan, you're joining us from the early morning side of the world. So it's lovely to have you with us today. This is a great honor, and so many people have been waiting for this. And, you know, we want to apologize for those who weren't able to get a ticket, but this session is being recorded, and this lovely discussion will also be on YouTube, on our YouTube channel very soon. So this is going to be the first ever conversation between the two arts-based research pillars and novelists, Susan Rowland and Patricia Leavy. So we're going to be discussing a lot of things about arts-based research and about Susan and Patricia's journeys with novel writing and arts-based research. So what is it and what makes it stand out from other research methods? Also, how does it help generate insight, creativity, and knowledge? What are its constructive and deconstructive aspects that are needed in today's cultural scene? And where does the Jungian factor come into play with Susan? So this is going to be fun. We will be having this conversation for around an hour, and then we will open the floor for everybody else to ask questions and engage in the discussion. Feel free to post your questions in the chat box if you like, although we won't be able to address them until after the first part of the session, so after the first hour. So thank you again for being here. And I'd like to give a little introduction, although no introduction is needed for Susan and Patricia. Susan Rowland PhD is a Jungian arts-based research novelist using the mystery genre to explore the marginalized feminine in trauma, abused women, mental illness, the climate emergency, myth, racism, and origin stories. The Sacred Well Murders was published in 2022 and the Alchemy Fire Murder in 2023. 2 more manuscripts in the series are in process. Also, building upon the work of Dr. Patricia Leavy, Susan articulated the framework of Jungian Arts-Based Research in Jungian Arts-Based Research and the Nuclear Enchantment of New Mexico, which was published in 2020. Although in practice for some time in the work of Sean McNiff and many Jungian-oriented artists, Susan's book sets out the ways in which Jungian arts-based research related to arts-based research and artography. Dr. Patricia Leavy is a sociologist, best-selling author, and arts advocate. She has published over 40 books, earning commercial and critical success in both nonfiction and fiction, and her work has been translated into many languages. Her works have garnered many book awards, including USA Best Book Awards, Independent Press Awards, International Impact Book Awards, National Indie Excellence Awards, Firebird Book Awards, International Book Awards, New York City Big Book Awards, and American Fiction Awards. Most recently, her novel Hollyland received a Literary Titan Book Award for fiction. She has also received career awards from the New England Sociological Association, the American Creativity Association, the American Educational Research Association, the International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry, and the National Art Education Association. In 2018, she was honored by the National Women's Hall of Fame, and SUNY New Paltz established the Patricia Leavy Award for Art and Social Justice. And not to mention, Patricia also got a shout out from Oprah a few weeks ago. So yay, so happy to have you both here, Susan and Patricia. So I want to start first by asking Patricia about how she stumbled across arts-based research. So how did this all start?
Well, I want to say hello to everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I'm so excited to be here, Susan. We've been looking forward to this and emailing about it for ages, so it's a real treat to have this conversation with you, and boundless thanks to Rula for organizing this and those lovely introductions. Stumbled upon is exactly the right phrasing, because that is definitely how I came to arts-based research. So just sort of a little bit of background. I mean, I grew up completely immersed in the arts and in love with the arts. My mother is a painter. There are multiple visual artists in my family. I started taking ballet when I was 5 years old and took it for 14 years. I was in a theater company in high school and actually began college as a theater major. But that was partly also because I was lazy and I thought it would be an easier way to do college, which it's actually not. It's a really hard way to do college. And I've been writing creatively truly for as long as I can remember. So just the arts have always been a big part of my life and something I really loved. And I didn't pursue writing or the arts in any way as a career, truthfully, because I think I had a lack of bravery when I was, young and making those decisions of what you're going to do professionally, what you're going to study. I think I actually would have loved to have decided at that point to study creative writing and to become a novelist. But I did not have the confidence that I thought it would take to put myself out there as an artist, which I absolutely think is just one of the hardest and most vulnerable things a person can do. And it does take, a willingness to have a life of critique and rejection, basically. And my 17-year-old self was not able to handle that. And I knew that about myself. And even in retrospect, while I ended up taking a winding road, I'm grateful for that road in a lot of ways. And I still think my 17-year-old self could not have handled putting my work out there at that time. So I started college as a theater major. And it was because that was my passion at the time. My second semester freshman year, I had room for an elective. I wanted to take intro to psychology, but the course was filled. And as a freshman, I got locked out. So my roommate suggested sociology, which I had literally never heard of. So it's like, sociology, what's that? She was like, oh, it's like psychology, but it's easier. Which for the record, I don't actually think it's easier, but at the time that sounded great. So I signed up. I actually did really, really badly in that class. I think it was my lowest grade in 4 years of college. And I had almost straight A's, but not in that class. But I loved the ideas, and there were just certain theories and ideas that made sense to me and immediately resonated. So I started taking more sociology courses. I tried to double major and it wasn't possible because of how demanding the theater major was. So I ended up changing my major to sociology. And then I went on and I got my master's and Ph.D. in sociology. And I did pretty conventional work, I'd say. I was always qualitatively inclined. So I did interview research and that sort of thing. But I published in pretty traditional ways. I published peer-reviewed journal articles. I presented at scholarly conferences. I did try to push the bounds in some of my writing and do things that I thought were a little bit more experimental or artistic. But basically, I was trying to conform to the academic mold in order to move forward in my career. And because I just didn't know that there was another way. And at some point early in my career, I started to seriously wonder if the work I was doing was useful at all to anybody in the world, except for to me as a line on my CV, just so I could get promoted and tenure and these very pragmatic, real things that I needed and many of us need in order to survive in the world. But I started to wonder, is academic writing any good? Is it engaging? Does it meet literary or aesthetic standards? Does it even matter? Because does anybody read this stuff? And then I started to do some research and I discovered that in fact, nobody reads this stuff. Academic scholarship has absolutely no readership outside of the academy. And that just is what it is. Some people don't like to hear that, but it's just a reality. Academic journal articles circulate only in university and research libraries. They have very expensive subscriptions. And people outside of the academy have no access to them, nor would they want to read them. And in most cases might not be able to because of all the jargon and the other stuff that academics are trained to use. So nobody's reading this stuff. And actually academic scholarship is very poorly read within the academy as well. So I think there's some sort of fantasy that, well, maybe the public doesn't read it, but it's read by our peers, but that's really not true. Over 90% of journal articles in the humanities, social sciences, and education have a readership of 3 to 8 readers. Okay, 3 to 8, so less people than are on the Zoom call right now. And you could spend years getting to that point where you've published that article. And I actually think the 3 to 8 is overestimated, because I think that some people download articles and they don't actually read them. And even if they cite them, it doesn't mean they really read it. You can read an abstract and cite something. And academic books are the same. The average academic book sells less than 200 copies. People spend years writing these, and that's just the reality. So I started to wonder, like, why am I doing this, basically? And because I was a qualitative researcher and I did study research methods and I wrote work about emergent or innovative research methods, I started to look into just different ways that people might do scholarship or might already be doing scholarship. And as Rula said, I literally stumbled across arts-based research. I hadn't heard of it. I didn't know what it was. I actually didn't even know the name at the time. I just created a folder called Creative Research Methods, but they were all artistic. And I later learned that the term most people used was arts-based research. And it instantly resonated. And I think partly because of my lifelong love of the arts and growing up feeling like the arts connected me to ideas, they made me feel less alone, they taught me things, they gave me insights into things. And so I think those experiences just made ABR make sense to me. So I started researching it, writing about it, dabbling. I started with poetry, which if you're a poet, that's an amazing skill, and one I learned I do not have, and a craft that really has to be worked on, and I had not done that work. And at one point, I just started writing something creative. I didn't know what it was going to be. It really was just something creative. And that creative something turned out to be my debut novel, which was titled Lowfat Love, which came out about 11 or 12 years ago. And it just completely changed the way that I saw my work, that I wanted to use my voice. I felt I was able to express myself in a way I had never been able to before. And when I saw people's reactions, both inside and outside of the academy, it was just clear. And it's not a great novel by any stretch, so I'll just throw that in as a caveat. It's like mediocre at best, and that's because I'm being generous, because it's being recorded. It's not great. I didn't know what I was doing, but it was heartfelt, it was truthful, it got at some real issues in a raw way. And it really resonated. And when I saw the reaction, the emotional connection that people had, it just forever changed me. And so something like 15 novels later, I've never looked back. And that's how I came to do the work that I'm doing now.
Mm.
Wow. So this element of coincidences and the series of events that led to you being who you are today.
Mm.
And look, a lot of my story is a story of failures. I say this because, as in your lovely introduction, people look at successes or what they see as successes or end results. The reality is that when I look at my story, it's mistakes, it's roads not taken, it's experimenting, it's trying things out, it's willing to be embarrassed, it's not willing to be embarrassed. It's all that kind of stuff that actually got me to where I am today. And to when I say where I am today, I simply mean doing work that I'm passionate about, work that engages me, that I want to get up every day and do. And that's an amazing feeling, and something 15 years ago I did not have.
Mm.
Wow. That's amazing. And how about you, Susan? How was your journey towards arts-based research?
Bumpy. Ever since I was 5, I wanted to write fiction. And I tried as a child, but it didn't go anywhere. I really couldn't do it. I was, in a sense, blocked for about 50 years. And I worked on that block by getting involved with Jung, because Jung is the psychology of the creative imagination. And so problems with creativity are everywhere, are legion, because Jung had an important insight. He realized that modernity was sick because it had repressed so much that was other. and that this repression had become a split in the psyche, which became splits in the culture. And so I was split off from my creativity. And so working with Jung and working through literary studies, becoming a literature scholar, and absorbing what is a very complex, much more complex than many people realize who don't work directly with Jung's works. But it's a very complex way of understanding the way the psyche works and the way creativity works, and therefore the way the arts work. So I worked with that for many, many years, and I wrote books on Jung and literature and Jung and creativity and Jung and the feminine, because of course, a lot of what's been repressed is feminine. And I also studied detective fiction, and I wrote 2 books on detective fiction by women. And this connected to my Jung work because myth is a narrative form, a narrative resource that is in so many cultures all over the world. And it's been saturated into different forms of art and literature. And I realized that there were many myths in detective fiction, and it was the myths that were drawing me to this genre. One of the myths is the story of the Holy Grail, but there are all sorts of other mythic tropes there. And in Jungian psychology, where myth occurs in culture, it shows the psyche at work. And so one day I came across Patricia's book, Method Meets Art, which is a wonderful starting place for arts-based research. And I realized that this was kind of speaking to me on multiple levels. So I started to read up about arts-based research, which is a thing that has developed in the academy and has had very little direct influence from Jungians, despite the fact that in the handbook of arts-based research, edited by Patricia, with a wonderful introduction by Patricia, in that handbook, C.G. Jung is cited as a pioneer of arts-based research in the Red Book. And of course, what a lot of the Jungians, I think, haven't really got, and it's to do with being a clinical discourse and having a relationship with science, is that art and creativity is a way of making knowing. It's a way of making knowing that has been repressed and largely lost in the history of Western modernity. And people like Patricia have got it back for us. So when I read Patricia's introduction to the handbook of arts-based research, one of the papers that I tell my students to read, she was saying things like, you know, artistic genres contain the elements of culture. The repeated elements of culture accreted over time. A work of art has a worldview, all sorts of things like this. And I realized that here were 2 things that fit together, which hadn't really been articulated together. Because if it was true what Patricia was saying about arts-based research and what art actually is, then it strongly implied a Jungian view of the psyche. Looking at that handbook of arts-based research, I was struck by references to the psychic image, to the origins of art in the psyche, and how much these different researchers were speaking a language that Jungians are very familiar with. But they hadn't got some of the resources that Jungian psychology has developed to understand how psychic images operate and can be encouraged to manifest. Obvious example that many people here know is this practice called active imagination, which is a way of working with psychic images that Jung devised in a therapeutic context, but it describes what artists often do. So we're particularly focusing on novels and fiction here, and we've all heard stories of writers and novelists saying, I heard the voice of my character speaking to me. Well, active imagination is a way of looking at that phenomena and maybe going further and developing it. So all I've done in this book is simply bring together the work of pioneers like Patricia and the Jungian framework to articulate Jungian arts-based research, which just adds a certain psychological potential to arts-based research, while arts-based research adds a cultural critique, a cultural therapy to Jungian psychology. And so at last, I wrote my novels.
Of course.
I'm reading one of your novels right now. Just want to give a shout out to Susan's novel.
So this is amazing. I mean, one adds the psychological dimension and the other adds the cultural dimension to it. So it's basically, it all adds up to being one and the same. Now, I want to ask a question that might be a little bit basic at this point, but some people in the audience or others who will be watching the recording later on might ask, and it's a question that many people ask me, for the fly on the wall. What is arts-based research? How would you define it?
Susan, do you want to take this? Do you want me to take it?
Let me just say something very quickly, and then you can fill in all the gaps. Arts-based research is making knowledge acceptable to the academy by doing art.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, arts-based research values the arts as a way of knowing. I mean, I've defined arts-based research, God, I guess for like over 15 years now, because people want a definition. So I've just always defined it as a set of methodological tools that adapt the tenets of the creative arts in order to address research questions in any discipline, which I've tried to make that definition sort of broad enough to encompass a range of work, but also specific enough that it's helpful to the graduate students who email me from around the world literally every single day and want help getting their work legitimated and that sort of thing. So that's the definition that I use. But really, it's, you know, it's about valuing the arts as a way of knowing. And I think, you know, we need to create terms and sort of link work together in order to legitimate it within the academy. But in a lot of ways, I just look at that as strategy. I mean, I really do. It's just something that academics have to do strategically if they want a different kind of work or what's seen as different or innovative or emergent to be recognized and to be valid. I just have to say, Susan, because you said you wanted to write a novel when you were very young. I tried to write my first novel when I was 10 years old. I was in my 5th grade English class, and my English teacher, who I remember to this day, Miss Mercer, who was so lovely, she exempted me from whatever the assignment was supposed to be so I could try to write my novel. And it didn't pan out because I was 10. So but I did try, and I'm actually convinced that when I was in my 40s, the seeds of what was in that novel came to fruition in a book I ended up writing. So I do think that sometimes it can be, you know, decades in the making, like you suggested.
Yeah.
Wow.
And one thing you said, probably in your early book about arts-based research, that, you know, what's wonderful is the way you've managed to marry the academic language of research, like there must be a methodology, to the practice of the arts. So when you said that the individual art forms are research methods, that really kind of brings it home, I think.
Thank you. I mean, that, you know, look, when you're talking about Rula, when you ask what's arts-based research, I mean, to me, one of the interesting things is also how it's changed over the last 15, 20 years, which is just incredible. I mean, I had the original idea to write Method Meets Art, the first edition, around 2005. I think I got that book contract. At the time, everybody thought I was crazy. I mean, absolutely. The only other book that existed was Sean's, and I love Sean and respect his work very much. It's not a methods book, his arts-based research book. It's a different kind of book about arts-based research, and one that I cite often as all of his work. But there was no research methods book about arts-based research at that time. And people thought I was crazy. Everyone, even my mentor from graduate school, everybody tried to convince me to do something else. Nobody wanted that book. And I had published like 6 or 7 books at that time. This was not my first thing I was ever doing, but it was the first thing I was really passionate about. So naturally, I had nothing but obstacles in my way. It took my editor, who is one of my best friends now because of this, it took her a year to get me that book contract because the publisher, you know, thought it was just a crazy idea and a trend. The original edition of Method Meets Art came out in 2008. And now, all these years later, it became my first bestseller. It's been translated all around the world. This is just a message and perseverance. And if you have an idea, sometimes you have to bring people to it. And sometimes, you know, there will be nothing but challenges and obstacles on that path. But I was trying to do exactly what Susan said. I was trying to name something and group it together to make it easier for other practitioners to do this kind of work. And so, you know, that first edition came out, everyone thought it was crazy, but it became a bestseller. And now we're into the third edition. And it's just a completely different world. There are tons of books about ABR. There are conferences devoted to it, journals devoted to it. You know, it's always like that. So I think when you're doing something different, like what Susan's trying to do now, marry these two sort of bodies of scholarship in a new way so that we see it and practice it differently. I think there's often a lot of resistance to that. In my experience, that usually means you're on the right track, that there will be some tests along the way.
And there's a lot of gut feeling involved too, to keep on doing this kind of work, a lot of gut feeling, a lot of heart, a lot of passion in it. And if we look at it, I mean, there are so many creatives when they find out about the term arts-based research, they say to me, you know what, this is what I've been doing all along. I just didn't know what it was called. So, I mean, people like Patricia and Susan have actually done a great thing. And as you said, you know, give a name or fix the methodology, make it more known to people, marry two bodies of scholarship, and just let people know what this is called and help them to do this kind of, to conduct this kind of research by practice. Because it is, I mean, so many scientists were artists as well. Leonardo da Vinci, for example, if we look back at the you know, the great inventions that arose out of his own drawings and blueprints, well, it's probably something that he stumbled across too, through his art. So I want to ask you a question now about your art, the art of writing novels. Susan mentioned before that, you know, sometimes we hear the characters speaking to us, and this is part of the process. So I want to ask each one of you how your novels usually come to you. I know novels they have their own distinct characters and flavors and everything. So maybe there's a story behind each novel, but if we want to look at the common thread on your novel writing process, how would you describe it as?
Susan, you take it.
Oh, all right. Well, because I've been not writing novels for a very long time, I've had time to sort of think about the characters that are meaningful to me. And for about 20 years, I've been, and it came through writing about women authors of detective fiction, and the way in which women writers have developed the genre of detective fiction to be less patriarchal, if you like. And so I've been haunted by the possibility of very unlikely female detectives, fictional female detectives. And it came to me that I wanted to write about marginalized women. I wanted to write from the point of view of marginalized women. And marginalized women include women who are marginalized for their age, for mental illness, and of course, women who are prey, if you like, who have been trafficked. And over time, this became a kind of mythical trio representing what's known as the triple goddess. And the triple goddess is a figure found in moon goddesses of the waning moon, the crone, the full moon, the mother, and the waxing moon, the maiden. So I had these three characters, and so they became the sort of nucleus of the stories. How could these three characters kind of incarnate as actual realistic type characters? So eventually they became Mary Wandwalker, my crone, my protagonist, who's a little bit older than I am, a good deal braver, and has a great deal of intuition. But she's marginalized because of her age, but also she's very poor because she's chucked out of her job at the age of 60. This sort of thing happens to people, and it can be a terrible blow. And she made some mistakes in her youth, and she has no family, so she has nobody. So she's alone, she's poor, and she's unoccupied. But she discovers that she has a daughter-in-law that she never knew because she gave up her baby for adoption. And she meets her daughter-in-law, who is a middle-aged woman who has chronic clinical depression. I wanted very much to write a protagonist, a hero, somebody with chronic clinical depression. Now, it's been done before, but it's not done very often. Normally, depressed characters are the problem in a book. They're not the heroes whose suffering is, in fact, a kind of superpower, because it gives them a kind of knowledge that might be very important and useful. So that's a big part of my stories. And the third character, this maiden, this very young woman in her 20s, she's a maiden not because she's never had sex, but because she grew up entirely without love. She was trafficked as a child, which is something that happens, and it happens to children in Europe, which is where she comes from. And she ends up being the girlfriend of Mary Wandwalker's son, who is also the husband of Caroline, who is the depressed woman. And the son gets murdered. And so the two women who loved him, his girlfriend and his widow, they need help, they need support, and all they've got is Mary Wandwalker. So the three of them are trying to survive psychologically and economically, but more importantly, they're trying to be a family. And I'm really wanted to write about families that are made and not born, and the importance and the capacity we have as human beings to make new families. And so the detective story is a way of doing that these three come together through the detecting process. Patricia, your turn.
That was great. So in terms of what my novels are about, they vary dramatically, even in terms of genre. So there's, an adventure novel, there's romance novels, there's women's fiction. So what they have in common is they have women protagonists, because I wanted to tell women's stories. And that, much like what Susan was saying, that my protagonists always are dealing with some sort of pain. And whatever that struggle is, whatever that pain, whatever that trauma, it's different across the books, wildly different. Sometimes it's low self-esteem, sometimes it's an eating disorder, sometimes it's sexual assault in their past, sometimes it's grief. There are many different shades of it, but these are always women characters that have real emotional, psychological, personal struggles. And the stories always have, I hope, an inspirational arc where the protagonist ends up somewhere better in herself, regardless of circumstantial things, ends up somewhere better than where she's begun. And whoever the other characters are, whatever the plot is, it's always just a device to get her there. So those things are less important to me than the sort of the internal journey of these women characters. And a lot of the characters in my novels are artists and writers and academics and publishers and people very much in our world, the world of people on this Zoom right now. And through my books, I am also trying to create this sort of philosophy of the arts. And so there are ideas and questions about the arts that are interwoven into each book. And so you might read one just as like a beach escape and just as a romantic suspense or whatever that particular book is. But there are these other messages in the books. And in terms of your question, Rula, about my process and where do the novels come from, of course, it's totally different. Each book it really is different, which is why I'm still in love with writing. It's never the same. It doesn't come to me the same way. Every book has a different challenge. I never know how I'm going to write a book. Ever, just so you all know that. I thought someday I'd figure it out. I haven't gotten there yet. So every time I have a new idea, because it's always a different structure, a different genre, I'm always trying to do something different. I never know how the heck I'm going to write it. So I have to figure it out and I have to learn. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm still in love with it. I will say I definitely I see a distinction between my early books and my later books I'm writing now. So my first 5 novels, they came to me, they were very grounded in either cumulative research insights from something specific I had done. So my first novel was based on insights I developed from like 10 years of interview research with women about their relationships and body image and self-esteem. And it was basically all my frustration at the things you can't say to interviewees because it's inappropriate, but sort of what I would say if they had been my friends and not my interviewees. And so I took that and I wanted to take those ideas and put them in a novel. And really the first 5 novels were like that there was something from my research or teaching or personal life that I had experienced, witnessed, a topic I wanted to cover, a theme I wanted to cover, and I tackled it that way. And I wrote each of those books like in chronological order from beginning to end. And then I somehow had a shift. And I've written the last 10 or so books completely differently, where the last 10 or so novels have each just come to me in a different way. Like one came to me because I was watching a movie and there was a song in the background. And then all of a sudden I got an idea for a totally different story. And the next day I started writing it. And it's very much been just these sort of moments of inspiration. I don't want to call them random because I think if you line things up in a way in your life and you're disciplined, I mean, I write every day. I think you also like co-create these moments that come to you, and you're able to take advantage of them when they come to you. But they've all come to me in these different kinds of ways. And the last 10 or so novels I've written completely out of order, just as a series of scenes. So I don't even know how many chapters each book's going to be. I don't even know if they're going to be the right length for a book. I'm like literally like crossing my fingers the whole time I'm writing, like, gee, I hope this turns into a book. So I have one book where, you know, all the files in my computer, it's like cake scene, party scene, this, because I didn't even know chapter numbers. And so that's how I've written the last 10 or so. And I have to say, it's been incredibly freeing. I've loved writing in this way. I've really been able to like sort of let go. Maybe it comes from not confidence, thinking I'm great or brilliant or anything like that, but just the confidence of experience of having done it many times and feeling like you do get better each time. Maybe it comes from that I'm able to write in a different way. But if you'll indulge me, can I read something really short? It's just like a paragraph, but it's something that, I mean, when, you know, I think Susan said it first, but I think you said it too, Rula, that when we're talking about what is arts-based research and what is all this work that we're doing, and we're talking about how we're just trying to give a name to this kind of work so it has a home in the academy. And in my most recent novel, which comes out next week, it's called Hollyland, which I'm super excited about, but it was a lockdown project. I wrote this during the lockdown because I needed to escape to something better than what most of us were living. And the main character is an arts researcher. And so people always ask, like, where am I in my novels? And I totally understand the question, but I'm sure Susan knows it's also maddening in a way, because even though, of course, your characters all have bits of you, they come through your filter, but they're very much also from your imagination, and you've created them and labored on them. So it's a challenging sort of thing, because, you know, none of the protagonists are me, but they all come through my filter. But I will say that the protagonist in Hollyland, she is an arts researcher. And so I definitely drew on some things that I know or have worked on or believe from my work over the years. And she is asked about her work, and I actually think it's like the perfect response. It's a better response, Rula, to your question than the one I'm able to give. My protagonist can give you a better response than I can. Okay, let me see if I can find this page. I think I know where it is. Oh, okay. So my protagonist, her name is Dee Schwartz. She's an arts researcher. She's in Hollywood with her new movie star boyfriend, and they're at dinner with a bunch of movie stars and a famous film director who's actually knows all of Dee's research and has read her arts research and is very enamored by her work. And so he asked her a question, and this is her response, which this is me. Okay, so I would say that this is a secret, but since it's being recorded and put on YouTube, it's a horrible secret. But people want to know where I am in my books. This is one example of this. This comes from me. Okay, so he says to her, "What inspired you to study the arts in the unique way you have? What do you want next?" "I love the arts, have since I was a little girl, sitting in a movie theater, going to a concert, reading a novel. It all just seemed magical. Who wouldn't benefit from more magic in their lives?" Rye put his arm around her and she nuzzled closer to him. "At some point, I realized that for all the arts bring to our lives, they aren't valued. Our education system is proof of that. I had the foolish idea that if I could explain the science of art, explore how people experience art and learn from it, that maybe we'd start to value it more." She stopped and sighed, but truthfully, it's all bullshit. Oliver looked stunned. "Why do you say that?" "Don't misunderstand me. Everything I've researched and written is true. It's just that it shouldn't matter. We should value art for art's sake, but sometimes people can't see what's right in front of them, so you have to give them a way to see it." And that is the reason in 2005, I wrote the first edition of Method Meets Art, to try and give people a way to see what I think intuitively most of us already know or feel or believe. So thank you for indulging me.
Oh, thank you for sharing it with us. You know what? I love everything you both said about your writing processes. And, you know, there are so many things that were similar in terms of, for example, you're collecting information in a way about women who are marginalized, about women who are trafficked, about women who have body image issues, for example. So that's probably where the research comes in. And the characters, they are part of you, but again, they are very independent. They are a part of the world, but again, they have their own spirit and soul, and they exist in the medium of the book. But something striking about it, and I think we can add in here, Jung can step in and add the metaphor of alchemy. How, for example, Patricia, you say, you start off with different scenes. You wouldn't want to call it random, but it's, it doesn't come with the order in the beginning. And Susan, likewise. So is it like the confused mass, or to use alchemical terms, the massa confusa, or the very first alchemical stage, and then how things kind of fall into place in a way, how they find their own order? Do you see that in your work? Do you see things happening? I mean, you're there, you're the maestro, but things happen the way they should. It kind of gradually falls into place, everything. So you have an idea.
The best parts of my novels were not planned. They came to fruition. I could never plan them ever. And it's why I'm in love with writing. I mean, it really is those moments, because a lot of it, and I've written a lot. I write 7 days a week. So I obviously am committed to writing. I obviously love it, because nobody would write as much as I did if they didn't have some enjoyment or pleasure from it. But that being said, a lot of it is really hard, and a lot of it is plodding away, and a lot of it is work, and is not some sort of divine magical inspiration. I don't sit with it just flowing out every day. I wish it were like that. It's not, but I have times like that. I have moments like that. And because I sit and do the work every day, when those moments come, I can take advantage of it. And I think the more you do have the discipline, the more those moments come to you, like you've done the work for them. So I absolutely feel like it's a process of discovery. As all the arts are. This just happens to be the art form that I'm engaged in. And the best moments are not planned. And when I say that, like, even when I'm writing scenes, I usually know what the whole plot is. I just see scenes and I start with the one that feels strongest to me, or whatever it is, and I do stitch them. I usually do have a sense. I know the beginning, middle, and end. But that being said, the most important moments are not the major plot points. They're the beautiful little moments where a theme is reverberated through 3 characters that I will never be smart enough to have come up with that. It just had to happen. And there are these beautiful moments where, sometimes I'm literally like, oh my God, I read something back and I'm like, that's so amazing. And I don't mean it in an arrogant way, because I don't even feel like I did it. Like, I really don't. I feel like it is something that was discovered in this creative process, of which I am a part. But I think that these stories and things exist in the world too. And I think in a lot of ways that we are channeling and co-creating with stories that exist. And we just sort of do the work as scribes, or however you want to look at it. But yes, absolutely. Like even the books that I planned out, my first novels, where I really had an outline and a structure, and I needed that at that time. Still, the best moments of those books were completely unplanned. They were a character said something that I had no idea they were going to say, which caused another character to respond in a way I couldn't have predicted, which caused a theme to be reinforced in some special way that I will never be smart enough to have planned. So yes, very much so, Rula. What about you, Susan?
Imagination.
So Rula, not alchemy as a metaphor. It is alchemy. It is alchemy, and you know that as a poet and a writer yourself, that alchemy is the art and science of transformation, and that's what artists do. And the more you allow your artistic process to be in dialogue with the unknown psyche, the more alchemical and transformative it becomes. And so people might say, you claim that your novels are arts-based research, so what did you find out? Well, as Patricia points out, it's not always about finding out new stuff. But I do find that writing the novels, I find out new stuff, that stuff comes up that I want to put in the story, which then turns out to have actually happened or be happening somewhere in the world. And not only the processes of writing, but I think the very processes of narrative itself often fall into patterns described by the alchemists. So at the very end of the Alchemy Fire Murder, I realized that actually it was a bit like this. So you can see that the story begins with Massa Confusia, it goes on to Salutio, Putrefactio, that's not a good point, and so on and so forth. Jung names 12 alchemical processes that the alchemists use, and I found all those processes were coming up in the novel. So yeah, this is what we do. Alchemy is I think a very strong ancestor of today's arts-based research. Holyland, which I've had the privilege and pleasure to read, there is some fascinating stuff there about how Dee, the protagonist, operates by doing both science and art, and that science and art are not different. That actually they are one enterprise within making a work of art, and that's stunning and really important.
You are so kind. Thank you. And, you know, one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking and when Rula was talking before is, you know, any piece of art, so whether it's one of our novels or something else, it's always going to be more than the sum of its parts. Yeah. And that's one of the amazing things too. So it's more than the characters we create, the plot we come up with. Something else happens when it becomes a whole work. And it's that makes it whatever it is and impacts people who choose to experience it, however they might be impacted. And it's not just, you know, it's not just character sketches and a plot outline. You know, you can come up with some brilliant idea for a plot and characters that sound like likable people or whatever it might be, but there's something bigger that happens in the creation of a story world, or I imagine really any kind of artwork, but we're talking about fiction. And in that story world, the story world itself, it is this bigger thing. And I think it's an amazing thing to be a part of creating that. And it's also an amazing thing to experience it. I mean, I, you know, read for pleasure all the time, and I love sitting on an airplane or on the beach or just cozy in my office or my living room reading a novel. And one of the great things is like when you forget to have lunch because you're just like, you're into it, like you're there, you're into it. And that's bigger than whatever the description on the back of the book is. The description on the back of the book is who the characters are and what the plot is. Your experience of the book is not that, it's something bigger. And I think that's something that's very, very special about creating fiction or whatever your art form might be.
So this notion, it's a fascinating notion, how every piece of art, in this example, the novel, is bigger, is beyond, is a lot more than the sum of its parts. And then again, with arts-based research, I mean, you're writing a novel, but you are crossing disciplines and you are bridging gaps and doing all that. The term interdisciplinarity, of course, I mean, this is an interdisciplinary process that is happening because you are researching here and there, a bit of science, a bit of history, a bit of, you know, maybe not research per se, but you're not really sitting in the library for hours every day, but ideas come in and you want to know more about them and you want to make sure that the scenes are fitting in truth and all that. But then again, there's another term, there's transdisciplinarity, and it has the notion of transcending disciplines. How would you explain the difference? I mean, they're very similar, but how are they different? Interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. How different are they?
That's something, I mean, but you could go first. We both written about this.
We have, but I think you've written more, so go for it.
Well, I wrote a book about transdisciplinary research, I don't know, over 10 years ago. I mean, but really, I just would go to Rula. I mean, it's just the idea of transcending disciplines. So it's not just about fitting different disciplines together, but creating something that's bigger than the sum of the parts. I mean, that's how I look at it. And I know, I mean, I read a chapter that Susan was kind enough to send me, which was really a lot about transdisciplinary approach to arts-based research. So you might want to add to that, but to me, it really is about, you know, when you look at multidisciplinary research, it's really like taking 2 or 3 or however many disciplines and like tacking them together. Like that's sort of the idea. And with interdisciplinary research, the idea is that it's a bit more integrated. I think with transdisciplinary research, you're really looking at just drawing from different resources, so worldviews, perspectives, bodies of knowledge, whatever that might be, and you're using the different lenses, but you're transcending them to create something different. I mean, I would say something bigger, but you can even just say something different. What do you think, Susan? I know you've written a lot about this as well.
Well, I think slightly differently on this, but I don't think we're disagreeing. I wouldn't use the word transcendent at all, because I think it's confusing. I think it adds something that you can kind of get beyond disciplines and they don't kind of matter anymore. Also, I've never, ever encountered interdisciplinary work that was interdisciplinary. There's, you know, a lot of work claims to be interdisciplinary, and yes, you're absolutely right, Patricia, the idea that you integrate both disciplines, it usually turns out that one discipline is controlling the other. That's you know, that's the problem. It's an attempt to address a huge problem in academia, which reflects a huge problem in the world, which is the whole business of things being split off and hierarchies being erected, that one kind of knowledge is more important than another kind of knowledge, and which brings us back to, of course, what arts-based research is trying to do. I'm very struck by the transdisciplinarity described by Basara Niculescu. His great book on this is From Modernity to Cosmodernity. And he's not describing anything that we could call transcending. What he's describing is bringing together all the different kinds of knowledge, the kinds of knowledge that universities have been doing in the Western world, but also the kinds of knowledge of indigenous cultures, also the kinds of knowledge that have been preserved by the arts. And crucially, he says that there must be a space for the unknown and the sacred. The sacred is one way of preserving the space for the unknown, because there are kinds of knowledge that we do not yet know of. And there are capacities in human beings where knowledge may not be the right way of thinking about those capacities. We need those other psychic spaces and the potential for knowledge to grow and change to be in the picture. So it's not about transcending, it's about revisioning knowledge as a network that is connected without dominating. So no one knowledge, in this transdisciplinarity, no one knowledge is more powerful, more dominant, more true than any other. If it's survived, if it's come from a society and it's survived and it's been useful, then it's in there and it's not to be despised or marginalized or repressed or reinterpreted as something else. And that rightly is not only a vision about knowledge, it's a vision about society. It's a vision about how we might become a planet where we are connected in a good way, and where we could actually address planetary problems like the climate emergency. So this kind of transdisciplinarity is a perfect kind of almost summons into being arts-based research, because it values the knowledges that have been, one might say, relegated or consigned to the arts. And I actually have been in contact with Niculescu over 2 of my books, and he was kind enough to write a little comment for Jungian Arts-Based Research and the Nuclear Enchantment of New Mexico, because he recognized that we were describing a transdisciplinary methodology. So you don't have to have all the disciplines in the world in your transdisciplinary work. What you do have to have is every kind of knowledge is valued for itself, which is very similar to what Patricia's saying about art needs to be valued for itself.
You know, it's so interesting, Susan, when you were talking, I was thinking about, and you're talking about Indigenous knowledge and different kinds of knowledge being valued for what they are. I was thinking back a few years ago when my novel Spark came out, and my novel Spark is a novel that's set at a seminar in Iceland where some of the supposedly greatest thinkers in the world are all sort of brought together and asked to answer a question. And they're put in groups of 7. And so I have this one group of 7 characters that you follow throughout the novel. And there are artists, there are social scientists, there are neuroscientists, but there's a farmer in the group. And I can't tell you, I mean, I went around the world for like a year talking about this book, and the questions I got most were, why is there a farmer in the group? Like how that, and it was all about valuing different kinds of knowledge building and what people, the new ways of seeing people can develop together when different forms of knowledge are valued. But it was so, and I actually had a farmer help me write one of the scenes in that book, so that it would be authentic. And yeah, I was in a writing group, which I'm not in that group anymore. I'm in a different writing group now, but one of the people in the writing group was an elderly farmer, like in his 70s, and now he's retired. So he writes short stories. And so when I was writing that book, I contacted him and I was like, you got to help me out. I need you to explain A, B, and C. It's about chickens and eggs. Okay. But I was like, I need you to explain this. I need you to write it down for me the way. And he was like, well, how do you want me to write it? I'm like, I want you to write it exactly the way you would really explain it to someone. And so he did. And so then I revised it to make the dialogue fit, but I took, 90% of that scene he wrote. But it's just so interesting because of all the things people could have asked me about that book, that was one of the big things, and especially among academics. Why is there a farmer here? Like, what's his knowledge? I mean, it's just, there's a long way to go with living up to these ideals and these values that I think that many of us hold and are striving toward.
I love how transdisciplinarity, in the sense, looks like it does the disciplines more justice, because it's non-hierarchical in a way, in a sense.
Absolutely is. Absolutely is. Hierarchy is explicitly banned. And that means it is actually a kind of social justice model of knowledge. And that's
absolutely
really important. And arts-based research is so valuable in that way.
It's so fascinating looking at it this way, because many people, they often replace the 2 terms, transdisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, tomato, same thing. But if you look at it, no, I mean, there's a very important core difference here. And as Susan mentions, whenever there's interdisciplinarity, oftentimes there's one discipline that's trumping the other, and it's just, there's no equality between the 2 or the 3 or the however many that we have.
It's the same thing that happens in mixed methods research all the time, where, you know, the idea in mixed methods research is that both forms of research are valuable and they're also integrated in producing something that neither could produce alone. But often when you read the journal article that results, or whatever the report is that results, you can see very much that there was one dominant method and then the other was sort of, you know, added for, you know, color, texture, or whatever. And it doesn't really live up to the ideal of what that might mean and could mean.
Mhm. This is very interesting. This has been very lovely. And of course, you know, you could feel free to leave the links to your books in the chat box. Patricia, your book will be coming out very soon. Susan, your book has
Yeah,
just recently come out.
My new book is Hollyland. It'll be out everywhere, but I mean, you can pre-order. It's literally available everywhere. And then my recent nonfiction one is my book, Reinvention: Methods of Social Fiction. So for anyone who's actually interested in writing fiction, which is something Susan and I obviously do. I wrote this during the pandemic because for years people asked me, can you write a book about how you do this? Like what, you know, fiction based on research is, how one might write it. And so I had time during the lockdown. So I was like, okay, I'm going to give them what they want. So Reinvention: Methods of Social Fiction just came out recently too. And I'm sure Susan will talk about her own book, but I just want to say I'm already hooked on it. So I'll be getting the second one when I'm done with this one.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both. Thank you. This has been lovely. And I cannot recommend Susan's book enough or Patricia's book enough. I mean, I've read 2 of Susan's books so far. The second one, I'm almost done with it, The Alchemy Fire Murders. And actually, Susan will be having a book club online on Zoom with Site Creative. And this is May 6th. Is it May 6th or 5? May 6th. Anyway, we'll keep you updated. So for those of you who would like to pre-read the books, and Patricia, we should also set up a book club, a book reading group, so we can discuss Hollyland. Maybe
I'd love to do that. I would love, we could meet as a group, do a Q&A. I would absolutely love to do that.
So, and of course, we don't want to give it all away. We just gave you a little teaser on what the books are about and a little bit about, you know, the story, how these 2 books came into being. So we'd love to hear your reviews. We'd love to have you again in our book reading groups on Zoom, either through Indelible or Site Creative. So, and now we're going to be opening the floor for questions. I can see a few chat box messages. But many of them are comments, actually. Thank yous, comments, compliments. And I see the first question by Nicole Brown. Do you both use software to help with the writing? For example, Scrivener, Plotter, etc.
I don't use anything. I'm very old school. I'm sorry, I'm boring.
Me neither.
No.
I can't get my head around that kind
Look,
of.
I'm so old school. I wrote my first 5 novels and I actually wrote the first edition of Method Meets Art by hand, like in notebooks, paper. Remember when a notebook used to be made of paper? I still believe that a notebook is made of paper. I've written many of my books by hand and now I write them by computer, but I don't use any special software. I just sit and write.
Wow.
I think Catriona's got her hand up.
Oh, I didn't see that. Catriona, sorry. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you both so much for that. It's really fascinating stuff. I just wanted to kind of, I know there's a lot of creative people here, but I wanted to just say a quick word from the academic community. I'm at Glasgow Caledonian University and have been interested in Jungian film studies for many, many years. But I managed to get our university to fund 2 PhDs on an arts-based research, with an arts-based research methodology, where the PhD output is going to be screenplays, basically, rather than a standard thesis. And I was ready for a fight. I was ready to defend. I had had Patricia's big book. I had, was there. And everyone was like, no, this is great. We love this. We want to do more of this. This is fantastic. And I suddenly found that I was pushing against an open door. And now I'm trying to get it into the undergraduate program as well. So that instead of just doing dissertations in traditional text-based form, that they can do whatever. So I just wondered if you noticed any kind of changes in the academic community towards ABR over the years, because I think everyone's just desperate for something fresh.
Yeah.
We're all writing books, as you said, Patricia, nobody's reading.
I think congratulations to you. That's great. You're able to do that for your students. I absolutely think there have been massive, massive changes. I mean, when I started doing this, whenever it was over 15 years ago, that it all seemed crazy to people. And now it's a norm in a lot of places. So it's changed dramatically. I mean, I'm constantly invited to sit on dissertation committees and master's thesis committees. And unfortunately, I can only say yes to a limited number of that, but the sheer volume, every year it increases. The volume of requests that I'm fielding increases. So yes. Now, does that mean it's the same at every institution and therefore that everyone is experiencing the same thing? No, definitely not. I can say with certainty because I also get emails from emerging researchers or graduate students who seem like they're on tears on the other end of the computer because they are at a school that does not understand what this is and they are not supportive and their IRB is not set up in a way that they can get their research approved. So that still exists. So for the broader community that might choose to listen to this, I don't want to minimize the challenges that some people still have. I mean, certainly when it comes to funding, there is less funding for arts-based research than there is for other kinds of research. But that being said, it is a different world. And I mean, there are schools that completely marginalized me when my work first came out, and now they invite me to do keynote addresses. And it's just a very, very different reality for arts-based researchers. And I think that's fantastic. And I think that there are some graduate students who have really helped pave the way for that. So I don't think it's just folks like Susan and I and Sean McNiff and others that have been doing this work. I think there's some graduate students that have been very brave and courageous, and some of them have gone on to produce very successful dissertations or theses that have gotten a lot of attention that have made it harder for the Academy to ignore this kind of work. I mean, there was a couple of years ago, I guess a few years ago now, there was a student who, of course, I forget his name right now. I don't personally know him, but there was a student who did his entire dissertation as a hip hop album. And he got news coverage. He was in major newspapers across the United States. And he was offered a ton of jobs when he graduated, or so was reported. So hopefully that was the case for him. Then there are people like my colleague and friend, Nick Susanis, who he did his entire dissertation as a graphic novel, which became the book Unflattening, which has been an enormously successful book, published, I believe, by University Press. And he's gotten tons of awards, but many other people have been able to do this work. I'm just giving a couple of examples because of students who are brave and are willing to do it, or who might be fortunate to be at a school where they do have support. And so they are also, I think, paving the way for others, which I think is awesome.
Great. Thank you. And I see Heather's hand up.
I think Kirsty was first.
Oh, Kirsty. Sorry, Kirsty.
Hi, thanks. Hi, Rula. Yeah,
Hello.
a question for both of you, or all three of you, actually, Rula as well. You mentioned, Susan, you mentioned about Jung and the Red Book and the crisis in the world then. And you mentioned again and then the sort of crisis with the climate that we're in now. And then, Patricia, what you were just saying about this rise in a new type of knowledge, and I'm new in inverted commas, but that's being accepted through arts-based research. And it was something we talked about over the weekend with the Arts-Based Research Centre, in that it does seem to be a shift in energy at the moment in terms of a kind of a timeliness around the alchemy and arts-based research and things like that. And I was just wondering if you had thoughts on that at all.
I agree with you. I mean, you know, I'm going to give the floor to Susan, but I do think that there has been a shift and an energy change. I experience it because I connected with people all over the world for almost 2 decades who are doing this kind of work. And so, and I just hear the tone of how people are talking. I hear the questions they ask. Now it's more positive comments versus they need help with something. So I do think there are changes happening. I can't tell you why. I'm sure it's a confluence of factors. I think that I mean, obviously we have massive social and environmental problems, and they do not fall discreetly into the purview of any one discipline. And so I think people are starting to realize that we're going to start to need to pool resources if we're going to have any chance at dealing with any of the serious catastrophes that we have on our hands. So I think there's that. I think that social media has changed the way people think about knowledge, share knowledge, all of that. I think that's been influential. And I think that there are some places that now look at the impact of research. So in Australia, for example, a lot of universities, they don't just look at what you publish, they looked at the impact. Oh, wow, that means people actually have to read it or cite it or use it. It has to be relevant. It has to be applicable. That's something academics didn't have to deal with for centuries, basically, that as long as you published enough, it didn't matter if a single person ever read it, which that's a system that seems in serious need of updating. And I think that updating is happening. You know, people are now looking at the impact of your research. So does it matter? Has it benefited anyone? Has it been downloaded? Has it been cited? Has it been used? And so I think those are just a few of the factors, but I'll throw it over to Susan to see what she thinks.
Well, I think you've covered it in a very insightful way, Patricia. So let me try and say something different very quickly in response to Kirsty. Let's do this in a Jungian way. And Jung was so into opposites. So this new energy, this new wonderful, creative, transdisciplinary arts-based research energy, it's absolutely a thing. The dark side is that I think one of the reasons it's a thing, and one of the sources of the dark matter that it is transmuting is the climate crisis. And you know, people are realizing more and more that you can't ignore it. Academia for 30 years has been really kind of getting into it. You know, most disciplines in the last 30 years, including my original discipline of literary studies, has realized that actually, no, we have to get into the climate emergency, even though, you know, we're in a culture that says, what has literary studies got to do with the climate? And surely it's all science. Well, actually, no. And so I think that as the sense of climate catastrophe has grown in the last few years, that there is a good side to that, which is that the artists are getting going, really. The artists are getting going, just like, you know, academia is getting going. And what Patricia said about the potentialities of social media is very important here. We know a lot about the dark side of social media, but there is also this kind of interactivity that this particular session is a wonderful example of. So yeah, we're in this point where we're recognizing the extent of the crisis, and that is one of the things that is fueling the creativity. And we need the creativity if we're to have the psychological strength and cultural strength to address the crisis.
Susan, I just have to piggyback on that and tell you, you're so right about the environmental crisis. About a year ago, I was invited to speak virtually at a conference in Singapore that an Institute on Policy Studies was having a conference, and they wanted me to do a talk about arts-based research. which honestly, I really didn't know like why they wanted me to do this, but they sent me very enthusiastic, lovely emails. So I said, yes, of course I'll do it. And had to get up in the middle of the night to do it because they're on Singapore time. As it turned out, I was in the conference for like 3 hours, and I stayed longer than my session because I was just really moved by what they were doing. But all the other participants were doing research on the environment. A lot of it was participatory research. A lot of it was community-based research. While we were having this Zoom event, they were suffering from a horrible weather event. I believe it was a tsunami, but they had just been recovering from an earthquake. They were all doing research on these catastrophic disasters that were all linked to environmental changes. And I was sitting there literally trying to figure out like, why exactly am I here? And they just, and the host kept saying, you know, like, we think we need arts-based research to be able to deal with these things, to be able to inform the public about these things, to share this research we're doing about these events. And it was very, very moving to me about how urgently people want this kind of work for the urgent problems that they're facing and we're facing.
Thank you so much. I mean, I totally agree with everything you both said. Just to add to that, since Kirsty wanted the three of us to give our input on the idea, during lockdown especially, from my own personal experience, everybody was so confused because of an unprecedented global crisis. I mean, there's always been problems in the world, but this thing literally hit the modern world by storm, and people were confused to vaccinate or not to vaccinate. Is it a deadly virus? Is it not a deadly? Is it an undeadly virus? Is it safe? Is it made in a lab? Is it just a natural evolution of things? But we were looking for answers. So I guess that research mode was on in a way, and it was coupled with the art making instinct, if you want to call it an instinct. But I mean, not everybody was baking banana bread and writing poems, but this is what I was doing. I mean, I found myself needing to create. And then with time, I felt the need to connect with others who are creating as well. And I think it was a natural response to the isolation that many of us felt during that time. We couldn't travel to see family. We couldn't go out with our friends. But here we were on Zoom, just like we are today, sharing each other's ideas and thoughts and research or questions or whatever. But we were sharing it through art. Some people were presenting photos. Others were presenting their visual arts and poems and stories and novels and all that. So I did feel the shift. I felt it quite profoundly, actually, during the past 3 years. So I think it's the need for answers and, you know, this response to crises in a way.
Yeah.
Right. And I will move now to Heather. Sorry, Heather, to keep you waiting for long.
No, this is all so great. It actually dovetails really well. So the avant-garde is obviously the advanced garde, and Jung speaks so much about humanities. The artist is humanity in the higher sense, in that collective sense. And he calls in the Red Book art, creation, and salvation. But what I wanted to speak to is something that we have where I live, which is that this is newly emergent, but of course it's a turning of the wheel. And so it's an ancient perspective. And we have a number of, at the local college, arts-based research facilities that are Indigenous knowing and a master's in Indigenous teaching. And of course, with them, I've had the privilege of collaborating, and even in the local system, in the college and otherwise, they have arts, it's ABC, arts bridging curriculum. So it's transdisciplinary, but with art as a synthetic lens. So I just wondered if you guys wanted to speak to that new perspective that's also ancient. You know, when I look at the Indigenous perspective, it's, you know, shamanism is knowledge and healing. It's also, the other translation is seeing in the dark, you know, and so it's this perfect ecological, of course, art and nature, as Jung said and Picasso said, coming together in this time. if you guys want to speak to that, that would be great.
Susan?
Well, I endorse what Heather is saying. I mean, one of the points of transdisciplinarity and one of the points of arts-based research is a way of integrating, or at the very least appreciating, Indigenous ways of knowing. And that, as you rightly say, Heather, that this kind of way of knowing through what we call art is ancient and does go back to the very earliest records of being human. We don't know what the cave paintings of 50,000 years ago meant to the people who made them. We don't know in a kind of rational, clearly articulated, certain way, but we can feel that knowing, and we can gain knowing ourselves by appreciating that wonderful art.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, I completely agree with Susan, is that arts-based research isn't new. Fiction is research, or social fiction, or whatever you want to call it, is not new. None of these things are new. We might come up with new terms as a way to house them and talk about the work that's being done. It's something that I've been dealing with for almost 20 years, because people are constantly saying, oh, well, you created this, or I'm like, people have been doing this for hundreds of years, so I definitely didn't create it. In some cases, I named it. In some cases, I didn't even do that. I'm just pointing out what other people are doing. So, you know, this work is not new. And I think one of the things that many of us are trying to do is to find a way to conceptualize it that is encompassing of all of these different practices, past and present and future. So in a way that is not limiting, but is honoring that this, in fact, is not new. We're trying to name and house something so that we can change the way people value it, change the way it's valued in the academy, and it's not just the academy, it's funding institutions, it's a whole range of institutions, it's the publishing industry. I mean, I could go on and on about the different areas. You know, I did a book with a creative arts therapist years ago, and I did the writing and she did the visual art, and the publisher wanted to pay me and didn't want to pay her. I mean, like, yeah. Are you kidding? Like, but like, seriously, like that's the world, because words are considered more valuable than the visual images, which that book, to me, that book was co-authored. So I actually ended up having the book contract changed so that she would be listed as co-author and not as illustrator or something that made it seem like an add-on, because, and that was important. But that's what we live in. And I think that's what we're all working toward. And so I think these terms that we come up with to house this, it's just an acknowledgement that this has been going on for a long time, but maybe we haven't looked at it all together. I mean, when I was writing the first edition of Method Meets Art, most of the scholars I cited did not call their work arts-based research. It was actually really hard to write that book because it was so hard to find examples, because I was looking for examples using terms like arts-based research. I had to completely throw that away to find the people who were actually doing it, but they just didn't call it that. Now, today, it's a lot easier. Writing the third edition was easy breezy because most people who do that work call it that. But they've been doing this work for ages. So I agree with you wholeheartedly, Heather.
Patricia, Dimitra is asking what book that was, the one with the artist.
Oh, Lowfat Love Stories, and the co-author is Victoria Scotti. And I'm actually very proud of that book. I think like maybe nobody read it. It literally
they did. It was brought up yesterday in Cambridge during our conference.
Well, you are very kind. Thank you. That was a case of bad timing. We actually worked really hard on that for years, and it was Victoria's first book. And I'm really proud of it. We had a beautiful collaboration, which collaboration does not always work that way, or at least not in my experience, but I learned a lot from her, and I think she loved the experience too. And it was an amazing experience. But the book came out within like a week or two of Donald Trump being elected president in the United States, which you can imagine, for those of us in the United States, was a pretty traumatic time. And so it didn't feel like a time where it was important to try to promote a book. So we didn't. And so I think that not a lot of people probably read that, but I was very proud of that. And she is listed on Lowfat Love Stories as the co-author. And we were paid equally, although because nobody read it, that didn't turn out to mean much, but it does in principle. So the principle was there.
Oh, thank you, Patricia. And Louise. Hello, Louise.
Hi, thanks, Rula. And thanks, Susan, Patricia. I don't know if it's a question. I suppose it's more of a question I'm holding myself for me. And I'd love to hear both of your thoughts. I've done arts-based research and arts-based teaching actually in organisations for about 30 years. And now I'm doing a PhD at the University of Essex. And the question I'm holding at the moment is higher education fit for purpose? And what I mean by that is, we all know the formula. No, it's lectures, it's seminars, it's essays. And then for me, being a PhD student, you then have a very sort of fixed structure that I need to follow, even though I'm doing arts-based research as my methodology. And so I suppose the question I'm holding is, do we actually need to change the education first so that education in university is arts-based learning, rather mainstream rather than at the margins? Because if that happens, then automatically the research becomes arts-based. But it's almost like, unless the structure changes, we're always fighting at the margins to bring something in that is taken seriously rather than not. So I'd just love to hear both of your thoughts on that.
I'm sure Susan can speak to this better than I can. I mean, I left the academy. So I mean, my entire career was oriented toward creating the best possible career I could leave in the academy so that I would have the ability to leave it, which is exactly what I did. So to find that purpose that I was chasing. So I might not be the right person to answer this question. It might be better. But, you know, it's interesting too, because I will say this, and I don't want to romanticize being on the margins in any way at all. And I know what those challenges are, and I've experienced those challenges. But I will say this, that there is something about being engaged in resistance, in doing something that is not totally accepted, but that has purpose behind it, that has a value system behind it, that has something you believe behind it, that I do think that is a certain kind of fuel that produces a certain kind of work that is needed in this world. And so that is not something I would necessarily run away from. But since I did run away from the academy, I'm going to pass it over to Susan, who might have a much better answer.
Well, I think that Louise is right. And maybe there is the possibility that if we grow arts-based research enough, that in itself will change the academy. Or we could change the academy to a more transdisciplinary model, which would include the valuing of art as a way of doing research, what we call research. And I think the transdisciplinary model is the thing. I mean, if people want to chase rats round cages, and call that psychology, then, you know, let's let them do that. And let the other kinds of methodologies continue. It's not the problem. The problem is the lack of valuing of the creative imagination, and that afflicts education at all levels. I have a PhD student who I think was here and isn't here now, but she's working on the way in which the imagination has been repressed in American children's education, and she's doing it through Jungian Arts-Based Research and come up with some wonderful material on this. So yeah, higher education, you see very nakedly the hierarchy that isn't restricted to higher education. It's there throughout education, but it's also there throughout our society. Government going on about STEM and deciding that the arts and humanities, are not important. Just at the moment, when we most need the arts and humanities to face what we are facing as a society. So absolutely, this is about big change. Thank you for naming that, Louise.
Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. That was a big question for a very big solution. Hopefully one day things
But
will
don't you
change.
both think, I just have to ask you, because I think it, so maybe you do too, that one of the reasons that the arts and humanities are so marginalized is because of how powerful they are. I mean, I've always believed that, and I've certainly seen it in the last several years in the US when I've seen what's happened to arts funding and other things, that people are so, right now we're banning books in this country. I mean, it's horrifying. What's happening to artists is horrifying. But to me, it comes back to what are people so threatened by? And it's the same thing, like when Susan was saying, we don't have to stop the psychologists in the lab watching a rat run around a cage. I mean, 15 years ago, that was what I would get thrown at me. And I say thrown at me, like, I mean, hurled at me, because people were so afraid that if you legitimate this way of knowing, that you're delegitimating that way of knowing, which was never what I was doing, nor do I believe it's what any of us are doing, or what arts-based researchers or transdisciplinary thinkers are attempting to do. It's not about that. It's about valuing, as Susan said earlier, these different ways of knowing. And in this case, valuing the arts as legitimate ways of knowing. But I always think that this attack, that it always goes straight to the arts and straight to the humanities. And I always think it's because I think that we know how powerful they are, because what really changes hearts and minds? I mean, it's stories, it's images, these are the things that actually move people. I mean, there are entire wars that are fought that people don't even remember what they were about, but you remember a single photograph. These things actually do matter to the collective and to how we think about the world and our place in it. So, I hate to take a negative and try and make it a positive, but if I were to look at the other side, like we look at the dark side, and if we're to look at the light too, then, if we're going to look at the positive, and that would be that there is real power in the arts and humanities. We can create real change. And of course, there will be resistance to that change. Do you two think so as well?
I think you're a Jungian by instinct, Patricia, because taking a negative and making it a positive is absolutely what Jungians do.
Well,
and the repression of the feminine. Also, and you mentioned it, that they've been marginalized because of how powerful they are. This is also just like the repression of the feminine, or the marginalization of women. So there is that feminine aspect to it as well. Right, so thank you. And I want to move now to Allison, who's been waiting for a while.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a really fascinating discussion, and it's really this. And my question comes up in quite a nice order, because Patricia just talked about power. So I mean, I've been using arts since I was very lucky in my PhD at the University of Toronto. We had Gary Knoll and Audra Cole doing Arts Informed. We had somebody else whose name I've forgotten from Australia. And there was a lot of people doing it. But I remember going to a seminar once with, I wish I could remember this woman's name, but a woman of color who does anti-racism. And she was adamant that there was no way in hell that she would use arts or be involved in arts methods because it was too powerful, that she needed to protect herself from that power. And so I've been thinking about this for quite some time, about the ethics of the powerfulness of art as a way of knowing in this hierarchy, in this very colonizing, I would say, I mean, I'm in the academy, but I think it can be a very violent place for a lot of people. And I think about Indigenous peoples in Canada. As a white settler woman, I sometimes bring coyote into my writing. And I've done it with, it's been reviewed by Indigenous First Nations people. I try to do it as a very, like, I'm addressing my whiteness and settler but I'm always, very worried about, am I, using the coyote? And particularly because what I've learned from Indigenous scholars in Canada, and also there's some really interesting stuff out of South Africa, is about that not all knowledge is for everyone, that there's power, it's sacred. And then, so I'm just wondering about your thoughts about the ethics of how, if we're going to have it in the academy, how do we make sure that we're not just bringing in lots of methods for people to use too much power that they haven't got the wisdom to use yet, or that we haven't. And, I don't think grad students or any of us want to hurt people. Often we're doing it for, these social justice ways. But as we know about power and privilege, that we can actually hurt people when we're trying to help them. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are. And I use arts, and I'm in academia, so I'm not saying I'm saying we should kick it out, but it's always in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question. I mean, the reality is that the different ways of doing research, different ways of knowing, they can all be harmful or hurtful. These things can be harmful, they can be helpful, and they can do those things for different groups and at different times and in different ways. And so, I mean, quantitative research has been very, very harmful to a lot of marginalized communities for 100 years. But we still do it. And I think we still should do it. So I just want to be here as an arts-based researcher and say there is value in quantitative research. And I'm not a quantitative researcher. That's not my jam, but I see value in it. And I think it's important to understand rates of certain things. And so there's a place for it. But my point is that, every kind of knowledge we build, how we do it, and then how we express it, has the potential to be harmful or helpful. And so I think the important thing is that when we're doing it, that we're asking those questions and we're thinking about it and we're being reflexive, and we're deciding. I mean, one of the things I think about my own practice is, what stories am I qualified to tell? And I think about that. And I think about that because, in my novels, if you look sort of across the body of my novels, there are people of different religions. There are people of different races and ethnicities. There are people with different gender expression, all of these things, because I want my body of work to represent the world that we live in and to represent, but I also make choices. So my protagonists have always been white women. And I feel like I'm qualified to write from that perspective. And so that's who the protagonists in my book to date have been. I suspect they'll continue to be that, at least as far as I can see for now. So I just think there's this balancing that we have to think about, that are we being reflexive? How are we using things? Are we telling stories we're qualified to tell? Are we inviting feedback from those people who might be represented by what we're doing. So, when I send my books out for feedback, and this is way before they go to a publisher, copy editing, or any of that, but I intentionally have a broad cross-section of folks that I ask for feedback. And I've even instructed my publishers in the past, when they do anonymous review, I know full well what anonymous review ends up meaning. And the problem, anonymous review is very complicated, but it's flawed. And I'm not saying it doesn't have good intentions behind it, but it's a flawed system for many reasons. I mean, first of all, even when my books are anonymized, the reviewers always know it's me. So that's a problem. And sometimes it's a problem because then they just say nice things when I actually want useful feedback. So the problem is complex. But I also know that I've gotten 5 reviews back before, and sometimes you can figure out who left these reviews. Sometimes these people make it known, or sometimes it's revealed later on because they agree to be revealed, so you can thank them in the acknowledgements. And I've had books come back where it's like, oh, 5 white women reviewed this book. And I'm not blaming a publisher because I don't know if they asked 50 people or 5 people. There is a process we don't get to see that results in those 5 reviews. But as a result of that, I have given specific instructions to my publishers at times where I ask, make sure that there are scholars of color, make sure I ask them to seek, you don't tell me who they are, it can be anonymous, but I need you to seek this out. There are things that we can do trying to be reflexive in our own practice. And I think your question is very real and valid, but I think it's a question we should ask of all research practices, and then come up with strategies, whether those are personal, like those that I put in place for myself, or collective, that we have standards that we try to adhere to. What do you think, Susan?
Well, I think you've just demonstrated that ethics is always involved in research. And the more ethical the research is, the better the research is. Unethical research is bad research. And of course, part of that will be the capacity to harm. I really like Alison's example. And I think the question about that example of Coyote is, are you bringing Coyote into your work, or is Coyote coming into your work of his own accord? And that is worth pursuing. And if Coyote wants to be in your work, then I would say, yes, he should be in your work. And that might be the basis of a conversation to have with where Coyote might be coming from, or where Coyote might be living in the culture of today. Just as Patricia has talked about it, I too, I'm trying to explore things that are ethical and that matter deeply and that are very painful today, such as racism, which I don't suffer from myself, primarily as a white woman of white privilege. And so I have characters of color, and that's really tricky and difficult. And I learn enormous amounts by trying to be fair to them, to love them, to honor their voices. And a while ago, Rula asked about where do the stories come from, and one of the origins for me at any rate is stuff that just wants to be there, that just insists on being there. So 5 years ago, my house almost got burnt down in a climate change wildfire. That had to go into a story, but then so did the racism that was exacerbated by the previous president of the United States. That had to go in there. And so these things become the energies behind constructing a plot.
Thank you, Susan, Patricia, and Allison for the question. Gottfried is next.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you, particularly, of course, Patricia and Susan. I just have three, as brief as possible, associations to the evening. I particularly liked just now, Susan, your stressing of ethics, and my first association is that this is well over 50 years ago, but the philosopher Theodor Adorno said there should be no more poetry after Auschwitz. And it feels wonderful how far we have moved away from that, where poetry can be a response to the catastrophe. My second association is that in a 25-year-old book, The Cosmic Serpent, Jeremy Narby writes about a chemist who goes to the Amazon forest and interviews the native shamans and says, how did you find out that this plant cures this? And the shaman answered, well, that's not a big riddle. The plant told me. So the chemist goes back to the States and does a couple of years of research, comes back to the Amazon and says to the shaman, you'll be glad to know it's actually right. It's proven now what you've been saying. And the shaman replies, what took you so long? And my third, very briefly, thank you, association is linked to somehow to Alison's contribution about power. It made me think of Fanny Brewster's books on, particularly her book on, we could call it an academic book on Out of the Shadow, about racism against people of color within the Jungian community. And she also writes poetry about this issue very, very movingly and very, well, powerfully. Those are my three associations. And thank you all so much again. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I've used that Adorno quote in many books, including in Reinvention. So I was thinking of it earlier too, but you said it. So thank you.
And I've always felt, as much as I'm allowed to say this from a German origin, what else but poetry?
I mean, you're preaching to the choir with me. I mean, I know people have different feelings, but I am Jewish, but I feel very, very strongly that where there is trauma, where there is pain, where there is human suffering, we need art to be able to express it, to emerge from that, to be able to make people feel what that is. You know, I mean, in a lot of my books, like I said, the protagonist is always suffering from something. So in some books, it's lighter than others, but I have many books where I have protagonists suffering, you know, the lifelong process of trauma recovery from severe sexual childhood abuse, these kinds of things. I feel like for me, writing is the way, or art more broadly, is the way to communicate these horrors, and is the way to share them, and is the way to try to prevent these histories from repeating. So thank you for your comments.
Thank you so much for sharing this. I feel touched and full of gratitude. Thanks a lot.
Now I feel that way too, so thank you.
Thank you, Gottfried. And we have room for one more question, and there's one more hand up. Heather?
Sorry, I hope you can hear me. Thank
Yes,
you
we
so much
can.
for this. Thank you. Thanks for this conversation. I'm actually a dissertating student in the area of health communication, and I have a very quantitative committee. I ended up having to put my proposal together during lockdown and was sort of struggling to figure out both how to really look in a holistic way at cancer survivorship, specifically women who have had mastectomy. And I wanted to look at a variety of different ways that women craft narratives. And because we were in lockdown, I chose to look at virtual ethnography because I thought, well, I'm going to be in a situation where I don't know if interviewing or focus groups will work very well during lockdown. And as I went through this process, I kind of went through an evolution coming back to my own creative background. But I do have quantitative people on the committee. So the general attitude has been, okay, if you can do it, go ahead and do it. And they are supportive. But it's interesting that lately what I've found is that there are many emerging scholars, newer scholars that are open in my field to the idea of more, if we use words like creative and also translational and autoethnography and ethnography. But I've noticed recently in mentioning within like performing arts communities, which is my background from childhood and so on, that when I start talking about the merger of the research and the artistic ways of communicating about the health and trauma and different things, almost more of a strange reaction from the artistic community, not the academic community. And I wondered if anyone has seen that, where it seems that in some ways in more creative or artistic communities, the goal is to captivate, but not always necessarily to elevate and educate in the same way that we claim in academic communities. This is what we are trying to do. So I hope I'm being clear enough. I'm saying a lot here, but I'm wondering if anyone sees that the part of the problem we face is not just that some academia doesn't want to accept us. And since I'm still dissertating, we still have a way to go to see how accepted my work will be. But I've certainly had good luck at things like conference presentations where I get a lot of interest and acceptance in that. But I'm wondering again, if someone were trying to craft a more unique career and go out there into the world, is it really just the resistance of the academy, or is it resistance in general, like merging these worlds, if that makes sense?
It's a great question. I will just tell you, I completely have this experience. So, since the lockdown, I haven't been doing this, but before the lockdown, I spent years really on the road, going all around the world, doing keynote addresses about arts-based research that I was invited to do at all different kinds of conferences and events and universities. For all different kinds of groups. And I had this just like really fascinating experience where one year when I did just a row of these things, I spoke to quantitative people in the social sciences. I spoke at a conference in Austria to neuroscientists, okay? All these people, none of them had a problem with arts-based research. Most of them had never heard of it. Excuse me. They weren't threatened by it. Then I spoke to a group of artists. They were sort of horrified. Excuse me. They were horrified because they thought that we were appropriating the arts and like bastardizing the arts. And so they were offended by it, but not the neuroscientists. So I'm going to stop and let Susan take it because I need to drink something because I'm coughing. But yes, I've had this experience. And it's one of the reasons I try to go out of my way to make clear we're not appropriating what other people are doing, or not saying it's not valuable in its own right, but I'm just using it in a different way.
Well, I think that sums up the position we're in as arts-based researchers, that we're not you know, this isn't about saying this is the way to do art or this is what art should be, that this is simply restoring, sometimes literally by restoring something that has been lost from Western modernity and that exists in other cultures where the arts are not separated off from other cultural practices like history and religion and medicine. So, I mean, the arts have are shaped differently in different cultures. It may be one of the definitions of different cultures that they have various meanings surrounding what art is and how they do it. What is common to all human cultures is that they all do something that we recognize as art. So I have great sympathy for people who want to hang on to their own way of doing something, particularly given the marginalization of the arts, the difficulty of being an artist in a world that doesn't appreciate what you do, and in many cases does not remunerate what you do. And just as we're not saying people can't chase rats, we're not saying people can't do art the way they do art. The important thing is that we should all be able to coexist. And if we coexist, we are richer for it because we create, as Patricia named earlier, a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. And so the arts-based researchers, the scientific researchers, the artists as artists, we're all a whole that is greater than the sum of those individual parts.
Thank you. Thank you for the question and for the answers. And Birgit, I see your hand up. So Birgit will be our last question for the day. We can't hear you. Muted.
Yeah, it's more of a comment than a question, but my association to the transdisciplinary approach has been the quantum wave. You know, because I have one of my professional works in the Jungian clinic and the other in academia, and my research has been in that area, but bringing them together with mysticism actually, and via positiva mysticism, and the quantum wave actually is able to embrace all the potential positions that are possible, and they are complementary. Neither of them is able to cancel anything out. They all can come, you know, potentially into existence, and so it's a cosmic embrace of everything that is possible. And I think that's the science metaphor, if you like, a good one for our time. And I have also called it, you know, this an epistemological democracy. I mean, what, you know, that sort of tails in with what Susan said, but it's just another, you know, term for it, or my term for it. And so I think that is the background for this collective story, if you like, that is emerging at this time, or one of the ways in which we can sort of see the collective story that is emerging at this time. And it is a very, very feminine sensibility, if you like, this cosmic embrace. And
yes,
that's my association, and I just wanted to share that and bring it in.
Thank you so much, Birgit, and thank you for all the wonderful work you do also for the intriguing research on the quantum wave. And so I guess much as we hate to leave, but I want to thank Susan Rowland and Patricia Leavy so much for the great, great honor of having this wonderful conversation today with all of us and taking the time to answer our questions and to take this journey of what is arts-based research, what is transdisciplinarity, and share their experiences with us today. So we're looking forward to many more events with Susan and Patricia. This is the first, but definitely not the last. So we hope to have a proper book group and discuss your novels further, and you know, stay in touch all the time with your updates and your latest news. So we'll be on the lookout for more novels, for more work. And I believe Susan and Patricia, I don't know if you, yeah, so you can leave your social media information if you want in the chat box below. So if anybody wants to get in touch, add you on social media, message you or anything, so you can stay in touch that way, or your email, whichever you prefer. So, and thank you all for
thank you
being
so
here.
much for organizing this. So I know Susan and I are very grateful, and it's obvious that everybody else is too. So thank you for all of your work organizing this, and everybody in the group for your listening and your comments and your questions was so inspiring. And speaking with you, Susan, which I've so been looking forward to, was so inspiring. And I mean, if you want to find me, you can just go to my website, all my socials, contact, everything's there. So it's just patricialeavy.com. But I really just want to thank you, Rula, and everyone for giving your time for this very inspiring conversation, which, you know, since the pandemic and the world sort of becoming virtual, I've grown to really cherish these things where you get to hear what people are doing in other places, and the different ideas people have and connect. So I hope very much that this is the first of other events, and would love to do a book club. So thank you so much to Rula and Susan and everybody.
Yeah. Bye-bye, everyone.
It's
Thank
a
you for
great
being
honor. Bye-bye. Bye. Have a good day.